What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today to talk about the career of Denis Villeneuve. Like many of you, I'm counting down the days until we get to see Dune Part 2. And to mark the occasion, I decided to put together a video celebrating his entire filmography up to the present day. And obviously, I hope that the best is always yet to come. But even if he never made another movie again in his life, I think his filmography, as it stands, is pretty goddamn impressive. And when it comes to film history, I've always loved looking at individual filmographies as a whole, especially if you have like a body of work that's roughly like 25 years or older. But to do so with Villeneuve, I had to up my game and address a few blind spots in his career. And I basically hosted my own little private Denis Villeneuve film festival or retrospective, where I revisited all the films by him that I'd already seen, while also checking out the remaining films on my to-do list. And let me just say that his stock was already pretty high with me, but it's climbed even higher now thanks to movies like, and I'm probably going to mispronounce the word, but Incendies, as well as Prisoners, both of which I finally saw for the first time and absolutely loved. So for this video, we're going to keep the format real simple. We're just going to go in chronological order through his entire career, all the feature films that have earned him his legions of fans, as well as those movies that might have put a few of you to sleep, because I've been in screenings for his movies where I've heard audible snores in the background, people just like ripping sailcloth. So I know you're out there, but if you end up taking an interest in some of these movies and seeing them for the first time, then mission accomplished. My work here is complete. And as I was watching his movies, I noticed a pattern forming that bore some eerie similarities to another director who's probably his closest creative rival when it comes to giving a unique style to blockbuster movies. And let's be honest, or let's be clear, that's a very short list of directors right now who have like the track record and the talent to put their fingerprints and their individual stamp on a movie where the budget's in excess of $100 million. So for the time being, Denis Villeneuve belongs in that very elite class of A-list filmmaker. But what's interesting is seeing just how similar his development and evolution as a filmmaker has been to that of Christopher Nolan. They both have their own signature style that are very different, but hear me out. So first of all, they both got their career started with a low-budget feature in 1998, Christopher Nolan with the film Following, and Denis Villeneuve with the film August 32nd on Earth. They've both made a feature film in black and white, Nolan once again with the movie Following, while Villeneuve made Polytechnique in 2009. They also both enjoyed early success with independent movies that play with the notion of linear time. Christopher Nolan obviously had Memento, while Denis Villeneuve had Incendies, and they both slowly graduated to bigger budgets with a successful thriller. Denis Villeneuve made Prisoners, Christopher Nolan made the remake of Insomnia, and now they've both made multiple big-budget science fiction films, sometimes originals, sometimes adaptations, working within a big franchise. The only major difference between them in terms of their trajectory is that Denis Villeneuve deliberately took about 8 years off in the early 2000s, but they also both share intense admiration for a lot of the same movies, like Stanley Kubrick's 2001, which is probably why both filmmakers publicly at least claim to admire each other's work. And I think Christopher Nolan has obviously enjoyed much more commercial popularity and is a healthy lead in terms of box office in this creative rivalry. But these are two of the only filmmakers alive right now where if I hear they're adapting a book that I like, or they're doing a sequel to an old classic movie, where I don't have like a miniature heart attack and start like holding my breath waiting for disaster, where I'll actually get excited to see what they're going to do with the material. And I guess that's both a sad commentary about the state of affairs in Hollywood right now, where the evidence is so overwhelming that they don't understand how to do adaptations of anything that has a pre-existing fan base. Like, I would just prefer that they do everything, do all original productions and just earn new fans the old-fashioned way. But two of the only exceptions right now, you have Denis Villeneuve says, I'm going to do an adaptation of, I don't know, like any old fantasy novel that I love from like my childhood or whatever. I'm actually curious to see what he would do. Most filmmakers, I'm like, leave everything that I love alone, make up your own shit. But why do I mention all this? And I think the reason I guess I'm so preoccupied with this creative rivalry between these two filmmakers, put simply, iron sharpens iron, and filmmakers need friendly rivals, or perhaps even unfriendly rivals. One of the most revealing comments that Quentin Tarantino ever made was that when he saw There Will Be Blood by Paul Thomas Anderson, he realized that he'd been kind of getting complacent and that he needed to up his game. And as a result, he went out and made Inglourious Basterds, one of his best movies. And I feel like great filmmakers in any era need close rivals to give them inspiration to aim higher, to reach for greater heights. And I know for a fact that Denis Villeneuve has been watching Christopher Nolan closely. He's discussed how he's watched Tenet repeatedly just to study Christopher Nolan's technique. And I'm sure he's taking a long, hard look at the success of Oppenheimer and wondering what are the takeaways for his own career. And I know that Denis Villeneuve wants to take a break from the Dune franchise before attempting to adapt Dune Messiah, but my question is, how high will his ambition soar, and what will he do next? Because I know he's got a mini-series called The Sun that he shot this past fall, which reunited him with Jake Gyllenhaal, but I'm talking about big-budget, ambitious, prestigious movies. And I totally understand that he needed a break from shooting big-budget movies, but I imagine sooner or later he's going to get the itch to make another flick and explore some new frontiers. So perhaps we can find a hint at what's next by looking at his filmography overall. But one last thing before we dive in, my favorite part of studying any director's career is figuring out which filmmakers they admire, and that's how my whole film history obsession got started. When a film fanatic really gets bitten by the bug, it creates what I can only describe as like this chain reaction that has a very similar effect, or a very similar addictive property of like a powerful drug, where each fresh discovery leads to this hunger and this lust to make more fresh discoveries. And so as a result, you're like a dog chasing your own tail, where it's just like you're constantly discovering new directors and which films they admire. And so the journey is never over, which is a wonderful, beautiful thing. But in the spirit of trying to cause as many chain reactions as humanly possible, here are some of the filmmakers where Denis Villeneuve has gone on record stating that he admires their work. And that includes Francois Truffaut, Steven Spielberg, Jean-Luc Godard, Stanley Kubrick, Ingmar Bergman, Ridley Scott, Jacques Audiard, and Yorgos Lanthimos. But as far as some of the individual favorite movies go, IndieWire has a list of his 30 favorite movies. I don't know when they last updated it. I think like 3 years ago. And I won't repeat them all, but these are some of the movies where we overlap in terms of my personal taste and his. But Seven Samurai, There Will Be Blood, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Lawrence of Arabia, Vertigo, No Country for Old Men, Dead Ringers, Blade Runner, huge shocker there, Dogtooth, Under the Skin, and Mulholland Drive. If you've not seen those movies, definitely hunt them down, and then watch the interviews with the directors of those movies and figure out which movies they admire. And once again, the chain reaction will continue. But also, if you're a real fanatic for Denis Villeneuve, as opposed to a kind of a Johnny-come-lately like myself, give me some recommendations down in the comments below, because I would love to know more movies that Denis Villeneuve admires. Because I imagine there's some French movies and French-Canadian movies that I'm unfamiliar with that I definitely need to see. But enough fucking about. Let's wind the clock back to 1998. I was still in college and had no idea who Denis Villeneuve was. However, his first film, August 32nd on Earth, got his career up and running. Now, if you haven't heard of August 32nd on Earth, don't worry, you are not alone. I had not heard about it until a couple days ago. But it's basically a light and charming experimental indie movie. And in spite of the fact that it's only 88 minutes long, it feels kind of sort of twice as long. Like, I don't want to be unkind. This is a fun, lighthearted movie, but I think it's probably the least remarkable or the least interesting. I mean, some directors out there, they come roaring out of the gate with their debut feature film, like David Lynch with Eraserhead, and like they're off to the races, or Terrence Malick in Badlands, or Orson Welles in Citizen Kane. Some people are just coming to this world more or less kind of fully formed, and some directors have to kind of warm up. They have to study and learn their craft, and they have to slowly but surely get to where they're going to go. And as we all know, Denis Villeneuve obviously eventually reached those heights. But I would never recommend that anybody starts with August 32nd on Earth, unless you're just a giant like fanatic or a buff for indie flicks from the 90s. And in the 90s, we just had this tidal wave of new filmmakers coming in with working with new technology, working at a low budget, and many of them went on to enjoy incredible careers. So I would say August 32nd on Earth, it's worth watching just to see the actress Pascal Bousseray. Oh, Jesus, I know I'm fucking that up. I don't speak a word of French, and the fact that all of his early movies are French-Canadian is going to get me in trouble repeatedly, and I'll just say, if you want to have a complete picture of Denis Villeneuve's career, definitely hunt it down. But he's made 9 other feature films that I think are superior. And just 2 years later, in 2000, we can already see signs of major evolution on his part with the film Maelström. Now, Denis Villeneuve apparently is not the biggest fan of this movie. I think I'm much more of a fan of Maelström than he is, because after he made Maelström, the way he described it, he wanted to take a 9-year sabbatical as a stay-at-home dad, and he vowed to return when he was ready to make a film he could be proud of. But I think there's plenty to be proud of with Maelström. You have this incredibly... how can I describe it? It's just, it feels like there are no rules. Like the rule book's been thrown out the window, because you have a movie where this giant, disgusting, like mutant fish that's about to be butchered up by the chef and served on a plate. He's telling the story, and he's telling the story as he gets, pieces of him pulled off or half his body hacked off, and just that whole framing device I just found to be delightful. And it just lets you know this is a world of unreality. No matter what you see, no matter how gritty and intense and hardcore it gets within the story, relax, we're all just having fun here. It's all just a story. And it stars Marie-José Croze, who I first saw in Munich, and I've just had the world's biggest crush on her ever since. And she plays a woman whose life is completely spiraling out of control. But what I like is how the movie never seems to be making any moral judgments. It just shows how between the drugs she's using and the booze she's drinking and the casual sex she's having, her abortions, or even just driving through random people with her car, and she's so hammered she doesn't even notice that she's hit somebody with her car and that they're basically dying in the street. I mean, her life is in free fall. She's never going to work. She's just a mess. And what's wild is how she ends up falling in love with the son of the man that she ran over. And so you get into some very complicated emotional territory because first and foremost, they have some absolutely wild sex scenes. This movie is not shy when it comes to on-screen nudity at all. And if you like Marie-José Croze, well, then you are in for a treat. But I would say this movie is not a complete and total success, but it's brassy, it's ballsy, at times it's operatic, it's very humorous. It's very experimental, and it just shows so much goddamn potential. What it reminds me of, if I didn't know where his career was going, if just seeing this movie in isolation, I would say this is a guy who likes Krzysztof Kieslowski, whose films Blue, White, and Red are some of the best movies of the 90s. But they're very, I say Maelström is eerily reminiscent of the style and approach of those three movies. But obviously Villeneuve was not destined to become another Kieslowski. He was destined just to become Villeneuve. In any case, Maelström might have prompted Denis Villeneuve to take a 9-year sabbatical, but I think the movie's pretty goddamn good, so I think people should definitely hunt it down. But in 2008, we see Denis Villeneuve starting to get the itch to become a filmmaker again because he made a short film called Next Floor. And he's made a lot of short films, but this is one of his big ones. But you watch this short, all right, this guy, he's already got more style and more technique and more production value than 10 other filmmakers combined. And it's just this disgusting gluttonous feast, whereas the people who are eating are, as they continue to just gorge themselves on whatever's in front of them, the food that gets brought in is increasingly elaborate and exotic, giant wild animals and things like that. I mean, it's just fucking insane. But you watch this and you're like, all right, this guy is destined for greatness. Even if he doesn't feel like he's ready, it's coming. But in 2009, he finally returns to the world of feature films with Polytechnique. But Polytechnique is shot in black and white. It's very short, it's very, very brutal, very intense. I don't think it's controversial, but it's quite shocking because it tackles the 1989 Montreal massacre, where a student goes on a murderous rampage, killing 14 women. And we see this horrible tragedy unfold from the point of view of one of the women that's being hunted by the guy, and a guy who's trying to... well, basically a guy who's in love with this girl, and he's trying and failing to help her out. But where this film gets the emotional power is just really putting you in the shoes of this guy and this girl during the shooting, what their actions are during it, and what kind of lingering feelings they have after the fact, because the two of them have very different experiences, which lead to very different kind of emotional consequences. But this is a pretty brutal film to watch, and sadly remains incredibly relevant and equally horrifying in any era, even though it's tackling 89 and it was made in 2009. Works just as well, sadly, in 2024. But the star of Polytechnique, the guy who goes on the shooting spree, he would reunite with Denis Villeneuve for his next movie. And I think this is Denis Villeneuve's first real major movie. It's the first movie that's an indication that he's going to be one of the best filmmakers alive. But what's interesting about Incendies, and I've looked up how to pronounce it many times, and I'm still not convinced that I'm saying it correctly. Anyway, that's as good as I'm going to get. Incendies. If you love Incendies, Denis Villeneuve has never made another movie like it, and it's almost, I feel like this is kind of a pivot point or a breaking point, because after this movie, he starts drifting more into Hollywood and working with major movie stars. This movie gets him a lot of attention. And so I totally understand if somebody's like, you know what, I just want to see French-Canadian Denis Villeneuve. I just want to see movies like Maelström and Incendies. But if you're more of a fan of his Hollywood movies, no, I want to see everything that happened after Incendies. Opened up a lot of doors for him. But I have to be very, very careful about how to discuss this movie because it's so powerful and so shocking and so unpredictable. I don't want to ruin the experience for anybody. I want everybody to be able to experience it for the first time, because in the last 15, 20 minutes, you're just like, oh my God, I thought this movie was intense and graphic and disturbing, but I had no idea just how disturbing it would become. But I should acknowledge that it is adapted from Wajdi Mouawad's play Incendies, which Denis Villeneuve saw perform in Montreal back in 2004. But helping Villeneuve with the adaptation is writer Valerie Beaugrand-Champagne, if I'm saying that at all correctly. But holy shit, how do I make the pitch? I'll give you the hook or the premise. Basically, you have two children. Their mother's died, and a notary is going through. He's the executor of the will. He's going through all the details. And the will includes two mysterious letters, and one of which is to the father that the children of, I'm calling them children, they're adults, but the children of the dead mother. But one of these letters is to be handed over to their father, who they've never met, and one of the envelopes is to be handed over to their brother, which they've never met. And they're basically sent on this kind of scavenger hunt around the world to learn about their family history. And as they're going through their various investigations, we see some of the events from their past or their mother's past unfolding in real time. And that's why I said earlier how both Nolan as well as Villeneuve had made early successful independent films that kind of play with continuity or linear time. Incendies definitely plays with linear time in fascinating ways. But it's just an absolutely riveting experience. And it helps that it's got like cool, beautiful music playing in the background by Radiohead. The song You and Whose Army is used very well throughout the film. But this is just an awe-inspiring movie of incredibly raw emotion, and it unflinchingly examines the cost of war, murder, torture, rape. And I feel like Denis Villeneuve, he doesn't avoid violence. He's not shy of violence. And you could almost say that with some of his Hollywood movies, he's almost kind of reveling in the violence. Like there's some of the violent sequences in Prisoners where you can tell it's designed to make you feel the rage of the characters involved in the movie. But what I like is how he never seems to be tapping the brakes when it comes to his depictions of on-screen violence. But at the same time, he's going to force you to kind of wrestle with the complicated emotions of being somewhat complicit in the act that's unfolding on the screen, because we are watching it unfold as it goes. Like, he never lets you completely off the hook for what you're watching or enjoying. But this is one of those movies where it's very easy to get a little depressed because it's just so relentlessly bleak in a lot of ways. But underneath all this misery and all these horrible discoveries and all these secrets that have been locked away for many, many years, the movie is imbued with a lot of love. And I think that's what keeps Incendies and Prisoners and some of his more gruesome movies, or even Polytechnique, what keeps them from becoming just these like relentlessly morbid experiences is that you do still have like love prevailing. I wouldn't say in the end, but in small doses scattered throughout. So yeah, these are tough movies to wrestle with, but if you love it, there's just a chance that you might be kind of bewildered by everything that comes after, because he's never made another movie like Incendies ever again. But I'm not alone in my admiration for this movie, because after this movie, his life and his career completely changes for the better, which leads to him becoming the king of the Toronto Film Festival. Toronto International Film Festival, aka TIFF, probably the most important film market that takes place in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, its only rival would be that of the Cannes Film Festival. But he's one of the rare directors where he had two movies play there at the same time, because after Incendies, he gets hooked up with Jake Gyllenhaal to make Enemy, but he shot Enemy and then went straight into shooting Prisoners while he was still finishing and editing Enemy. And he says the only way he was able to do two movies back to back like this was due to his collaborators. He's got great editors, he's got great screenwriters, he's got obviously working with incredible actors, but you can only go crazy with like an incredibly prolific output if you can count upon and rely upon some brilliant collaborators. But what it leads to is that in the fall of 2013, both Enemy and Prisoners played at the same time. Enemy ended up getting acquired by A24, and A24 is brand new. Nowadays, A24 enjoys this incredible reputation for taste and integrity and working with great filmmakers. But in 2013, A24 was a year old. Like, they'd only acquired a few movies. So one of the earliest movies they acquired was Enemy. And then like 2 weeks after the festival, Prisoners came out in the theater, distributed by Warner Brothers. But I'm thinking, I guess, what should when discussing a career in chronological order, should you discuss the movies in the order in which they were shot or the order in which they were released? Let's do Enemy first, because it was shot first, but it came out in the spring of 2014. But Enemy was written by Javier Goulan, who is loosely adapting the 2002 novel The Double by Jose Saramago. But this is probably the last of the big experimental movies by Denis Villeneuve, or at least he hasn't made another experimental movie in 10 years. But Jake Gyllenhaal, he deserves some credit for, like, I guess, rolling the dice creatively by working with Denis Villeneuve. Because after seeing Incendies, there's nothing there to indicate that he would go on to make movies like Dune. At that time, you're like, oh, this is like an experimental art house kind of controversial director. But Jake Gyllenhaal wanted to work with him. And the movie is pretty goddamn wild to watch. You got Isabella Rossellini in there. You got Melanie Laurent and Sarah Gadon. Both of them were absolutely on fire in this. But the premise is deceptively simple. It looks simple on the surface, but there's a lot going on underneath. But you basically have a situation where an academic and a struggling actor who are identical to each other in every single way, including scars, bump into each other, discover each other, and kind of sort of start getting involved in each other's lives in unusual ways. But at the same time, there are all these strange, bizarre dreams about, fucking giant spiders like looming over cities, and or strippers walking upside down through hallways when they've got heads like spiders. I mean, the movie opens up inside of a strip club with an exotic dancer stomping out a tarantula with her big ass high heels. And any movie that opens in such a fashion will always get my attention. I feel like if you want to make your kind of head scratching, kind of groundbreaking experimental movies, throwing in just completely, totally random, superfluous nudity or gratuitous nudity is a great way to keep people on the hook. Especially when you have Jake Gyllenhaal, like the twins, starting to get involved sexually with the other women that their doppelganger is involved with. And it gets into some pretty strange territory. And probably the strangest moment is the very last scene. I'm not going to give it away if you haven't seen it, but what's great is how it leads to one of the most shocking and horrifying scenes from Arrival a few years later, where there's a dream that Amy Adams is having about one of the aliens. And if you know the movie well, you'll know which scene I'm talking about. But it's like a carbon copy, or basically like a side-by-side comparison with the final shot from Enemy. But overall, I'd say Enemy is not necessarily one of my favorite movies by Denis Villeneuve, but I feel like it was a great experiment, and it hooked him up with this this major movie star, which leads to him being cast without even having an audition in his next movie, Prisoners. And I think Prisoners, there's a strong case to be made that this might be Denis Villeneuve's best movie. And maybe I'm only saying that because I just saw it for the first time. It's very fresh in my brain. I've been putting off watching this for 10 years. Originally, I went to see it in the theater with my little sister and two of her friends, and it would have been wildly inappropriate for them to see it, but they wanted to see it. Like, it was like a birthday party, like movie screening. Like, we want to see Prisoners. I was like, fine, let's go. But at the last minute when we got there, they decided they wanted to see something funny instead. I was like, all right, it's y'all's screening, y'all's movie time. We'll watch whatever you want to watch. And so they ended up picking, I think it was This Is the End. What the hell is that comedy called? I think it's called This Is the End. Yet another movie that's wildly inappropriate for young girls. But yeah, there it is. This Is the End. And I was like, guys, I'll take y'all to see This Is the End. However, everybody's got to be cool and nobody tell on me when we get home. And of course, the friends of my little sister, the first thing they did when they got home was like, Jamie made us see This Is the End. I was like, anyway, they threw me under the bus, even though it was the little girls who were requesting it. Long story short, I missed my opportunity to see Prisoners in the theater. I don't know if those girls would have even survived the experience had they seen it, because the movie deals with two little girls getting abducted. So I'm definitely not going to give anything away with this movie, but it basically, at its heart, you have two little girls who go missing, and the cops are taking more time to find them than the parents can basically live with. And so Hugh Jackman decides to take things into his own hands by hunting down and imprisoning the person he thinks is responsible. Whether or not he's involved or not, you'll have to watch the movie to find out. But this movie, it is so goddamn good. It is so relentlessly dark. As I was watching, I was thinking, this is what would happen if the Coen brothers in the 1990s, if they had decided to make a great thriller, but without any comedy or without any sense of humor. Like Fargo can be pretty brutal and can be pretty bleak, but it's got comedy scattered throughout, which kind of helps, make the movie a little bit more digestible. Prisoners is affording you no such courtesy. However, at least it's beautifully shot by Roger Deakins, and it must be said that Roger Deakins has played a huge role in the success of Denis Villeneuve, because without Roger Deakins, you don't get Prisoners, you don't get Sicario, you don't get Blade Runner 2049. I mean, all these movies look dramatically better due to the fact that Roger Deakins, arguably maybe the best director of photography in the world, is shooting all these movies. And it also shows what the creative community thinks about Denis Villeneuve, where a cameraman or a photographer who's a master of lighting and a master of shot composition, someone like Roger Deakins, wants to work with Denis Villeneuve over and over again. But what can I say about Prisoners without ruining the experience for people? I say it has as much horror and tragedy as 10 other thrillers put together. And also, the thriller genre is basically I wouldn't say dead at this point, but it's struggling. I grew up in the 80s and 90s where we got thrillers all the time. It was like one of the most reliable money earners for Hollywood because they're cheap to make and movie stars love doing them. But Prisoners, I feel like in the absence of a whole bunch of thrillers, at least Prisoners is one really good one. I remember at one point, like I was getting so depressed and just kind of so disturbed by watching it. I paused the movie to see how much running time I had left. And I physically groaned when I saw it 47 minutes. I was like, how am I going to take this for 47 more minutes? Because the tension and the suspense are almost unbearable. Like most movies, even thrillers and like serial killer movies, most movies are not this potent. And I think there's a case to be made that in the last 10 years, there has not been a thriller as strong as Prisoners. And as long as I'm showering praise on Prisoners, let's pause for a moment to shower praise on the great Hugh Jackman. We've seen him express rage many times in the past, and I think Logan is one of the all-time great superhero movies, and it's definitely one of the best R-rated superhero movies, but none of the rage that he expresses in Logan can come anywhere near the rage he expresses in Prisoners. And without offering a spoiler, I'll just say there's a scene involving a hammer and Paul Dano where Denis Villeneuve encouraged Hugh Jackman to be completely ferocious for the next take, and that is the take that is included in the movie. I mean, you see those actors dialed in for that scene. It's just incredible just how like they are so present and they are so invested in the moment. And just, it's an incredible ensemble cast where everybody's really bringing their A game. And I feel like this is one of those movies that's both a beautiful and horrific reminder of how important it is to craft memorable imagery in your movies. I feel like there's so many shows and so many movies these days where they're so visually uninteresting that they border on incompetent. And in the end, we are painting with light. Like filmmakers, they need to have a distinctive original style. In this movie, some of the shots of like Paul Dano's eye looking through that eye hole in his little prison with the light coming through, or just the imagery of like the snakes coiled up around like bloody children's clothing. I mean, these are some of the coolest images of the last 10, 12, 15 years. And justifiably, this movie was a smash. With only a budget of $46 million, grossed $122 million worldwide. And I feel like this kind of base hit success is something that Hollywood should try to get back to. You don't need to spend $300 million on a movie that nobody particularly likes, hoping to make $1 billion. Spend 46, make 122, and launch a brilliant Hollywood career for a dynamic new voice. And this movie, it was originally rated NC-17 by the MPAA, and with a little bit of finessing and a little bit of recutting, it got the R. But I would love to see that original NC-17 cut if it's available on Blu-ray anywhere. But one last bit of praise before moving on. I feel like screenwriter Aaron Guzikowski deserves a huge amount of credit as well. This was a script that was part of the 2009 annual Blacklist, and it was based on a short story he had written, but it's hard to have great filmmakers if you don't have great screenwriters to work with them. And some filmmakers out there are great screenwriters as well, but you can't be good at everything. And I think recognizing what your strengths and weaknesses are is incredibly important for a director. A director, in the words of Christopher Nolan, is somebody who encourages everybody on the cast and crew to do their best. And goddamn, when it comes to great scripts, great thrillers, Jesus Christ, Guzikowski wrote an all-time classic right up to the very last frame. I mean, I didn't quite know how the movie was going to end, but never in a million years would I anticipate that it would end in such satisfying fashion where I was just like, yes, it is like the perfect natural conclusion to this riveting thriller. So if you've never seen Prisoners, do yourself a favor. It's long and it's miserable and it's horrific, but goddamn, it is thrilling and unforgettable. And I think, like I said at the beginning, strong contender for Denis Villeneuve's best movie. But let's move on to Sicario, the very first movie by Denis Villeneuve that I ever saw. And just the fact that this is the first movie by Denis Villeneuve that I saw shows how late I was to the party and getting up to speed on his career. Sometimes filmmakers, you're just like, your ship's passing in the night and you don't even realize that a cool career is unfolding right before your eyes. But I'm going to blame it on my little sister since I did not see Prisoners 2 years prior, which obviously would have alerted me to the fact that Denis Villeneuve was a major talent to pay attention to. But Sicario, I just rewatched it the other night, and it holds up really goddamn well. If you love the TV shows by Taylor Sheridan, Yellowstone and 1883 and 1923, this is one of the first real indications that Taylor Sheridan was going to be a major screenwriter. Obviously, he's made his money in TV, but I wish he'd get back to movies because movies like Sicario show what he's capable of. But this is also yet another movie shot by Roger Deakins. And some of these images of the American Southwest and the border with Mexico, they're so iconic and so beautiful. They almost could be images taken directly from Dune. It looks like Arrakis, but it's just the American Southwest. But the cast here is really solid, and we almost didn't have Josh Brolin in this movie. Roger Deakins, who called him up, and apparently Josh Brolin was exhausted from yet another movie he'd made, and Deakins was like, look, we can't make this movie without you. Sack up and let's make this. And Josh Brolin, yeah, he just crushes it. And Emily Blunt's incredible, but this is the Benicio del Toro show. And apparently the character that he plays was originally much more fleshed out, but as they were making the movie, they realized he's much scarier, much more powerful, and much more intimidating if they start shaving off his dialogue and making him more enigmatic, and it fucking works. I think I read somewhere that they eventually cut about 90% of his scripted dialogue, and I'm like, I would love to read his scripted dialogue, but keeping him mysterious just makes him so much more of like an otherworldly force. He's almost like Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men.
Nothing will make sense to your American ears. But in the end, you will understand.
And like with so much of Denis Villeneuve's best work, it has an unflinching perspective when it looks at the conflicts between the American government and the Mexican drug cartels along the border. And as Josh Brolin says very eloquently in the movie, until you can convince 20% of the American public to stop using cocaine, well, then this struggle is going to continue, a struggle which results in dead bodies being buried inside the walls of homes, or people being beheaded, or children being dunked in acid. I mean, the human tragedy and just the atrocities that are committed on a regular basis in this movie are just awe-inspiring. But what I love most about this movie is just the gritty authenticity in terms of the way these soldiers talk to each other and the way they're trying to get things done, and what is the letter of the law and what have they been approved to do. And this movie really explores those moral gray areas really well. And Emily Blunt, apparently, she was sick as dog throughout the making of this. While Emily Blunt was shooting it, apparently she was on a fucking IV just to stay hydrated. She had such a bad case of food poisoning. But I feel like we get to see this whole phenomenon unfold through her eyes, and she just did such a goddamn good job. So hopefully Emily Blunt and Denis Villeneuve will find another excuse to work together in the future. But let's push on to Arrival 2016.
Now that's a proper introduction.
And what's interesting about Arrival in 2016 is that here Denis Villeneuve pivots to the sci-fi genre, and he's never looked back. His last 3 movies and his upcoming film in a few weeks' time, it's all sci-fi. And if you look at the early part of his career, there are very few indicators or indications that he's going to become one of the greatest living directors of science fiction, perhaps the greatest living director of science fiction, although Christopher Nolan might have a claim to that title as well, or maybe even Ridley Scott once upon a time. But there are not a lot of directors who are working in science fiction where, whether they're doing an original or a sequel or an adaptation, they all have that signature style. They all look great. And I feel like Arrival is a perfect example of thinking person's science fiction. And Amy Adams was just the perfect lead to bring this all together. I mean, Jeremy Renner does a great job as well. Forrest Whitaker does a good job. But Amy Adams, she's just so likable, and she's so charismatic, and she's just so pretty. It's difficult not to get on board, but whatever her goals might be as a character. But it's just so refreshing to see a science fiction movie that does not wear all of its influences on its sleeve. I feel like we have so many science fiction movies we can tell, like the director, oh, this director, they spent their entire childhood watching Alien. Oh, this director spent their entire childhood watching Star Wars. And that shit, it gets old after a while. It gets stale. It gets derivative. Arrival feels fresh, and the shots of the aliens in this movie, these ships like standing vertically off in the distance, they're some of the most beautiful and mysterious shots in all science fiction, where you see that ship off in the distance with all these clouds drifting in over a mountain ridge, and there's something about the way the shot was framed. It gives us this beautiful sense of scale, because you're seeing like a town and a mountain range and the clouds and then this enormous ship, and the only way you can appreciate scale is with comparison. And I just feel like it's just a masterclass of showing just how advanced this race is, how powerful they are, and how otherworldly they are. And I feel like the depiction of the aliens in this movie was the perfect training ground for Dune, because you can't just make Dune unless you've gotten some practice. It's kind of like almost like a martial art, like in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You start with your white belt, you earn your blue belt, you go to your purple, then eventually your brown, and when you're finally ready, you go to your black belt. And obviously right now, Denis Villeneuve is doing black belt level filmmaking. But you don't get there without making Arrival first. And it's amazing how dramatically compelling this movie is when it basically just boils down to Amy Adams' character learning a language. Like that's the gist of the movie. Learning to speaking a language and then solving whatever confusion there might be. And I love how the learning of the language basically teaches her brain to think in a different way. Like in the movie, they talk about how if you're studying another language, you're essentially are rewiring your brain to think in another way. But because of her ability to learn this new language, time starts kind of unfolding. She perceives time in a different way where it's not necessarily as linear. And so all these, what we think are dream sequences, what we think might be flashbacks as they turn out, well, I don't want to get into spoilers. All I'll say is that the images and the scenes involving her daughter are so painful and so heartbreaking. And I feel like Villeneuve, one of his real skills is that no matter what's going on in these giant otherworldly sci-fi, sprawling narratives, he never lets you forget just the bliss and the pain of being alive. And if you don't have that beating heart at the center of your science fiction, it can all get very cold and very clinical very quickly. So yeah, Arrival's got tons of heart, tons of humanity. I know it's the perfect training ground for Blade Runner 2049, as well as Dune Part 1 and 2. But let's dive into Blade Runner 2049, which I finally revisited after all these years, after it first came out. And it's funny, it's taken me years to finally settle on what are my thoughts on Blade Runner 2049, because prior to this movie's release, people need to remember we were going fucking psycho. I mean, when those trailers were dropping and we're seeing all those like Atari logos and just all that beautiful, weird, otherworldly kind of like orange radioactive imagery and that sort of thing, like we all thought we were going to see one of the greatest science fiction films ever made. And I think the reality is it's got astonishing scenes. It's got some great ideas. It's got some really beautiful imagery. But at close to 3 hours long, at times, it's a bit of a snooze fest. I think it brought all the kind of the nutrients, but it forgot to bring the flavor. And maybe if it had had a stronger ending, it would have left a more lingering impression. But there's so much. I mean, I'm so in love with Ana de Armas and like seeing all that iconic imagery of her as a giant like pink hologram interacting with Ryan Gosling, or the scene where she and a sex worker merged together so that she, as the AI, can finally have a physical interaction with the guy that she's living with. I think all those scenes play really well. And Ana de Armas, her face is just so expressive. It's a perfect contrast to Ryan Gosling, who, as programmed by his makers as a replicant, he's designed to be very unemotional. He only shows emotion a few times, but I think that was a mistake. It removes kind of the beating heart from the core of the story when your protagonist is just so stoic that it kind of doesn't allow the room to breathe. But I think if we're being fair, Denis Villeneuve did a really good job with this. But it's just not that much fun to watch, which I think is why the movie only grossed $92 million in the U.S. and $175 million elsewhere. I mean, the global worldwide total for this movie was $267 million, and the budget, as reported, was somewhere between $150 and $185 million. I mean, more or less, if you want to be accommodating to the film, it needed to gross around $400 million or more to be successful. So the fact that he was able to make this movie, which was not a commercial success, and go right into Dune and be allowed so much latitude and so much freedom, it shows what the industry thinks of his talents overall, like looking at movies like Arrival and Sicario and Prisoners. But I'm amazed that a movie, which was a commercial disappointment, still opened the door to this giant two-part saga for Warner Brothers. And it helps, obviously, that Dune Part 1, even though it was released day and date online on Max as well as in the theater, still did pretty goddamn well. But I think one of the main reasons people don't obsess over Blade Runner 2049 the way they do over the original from 1982, I think the movie perhaps spells out too many of the themes or too many of the ideas that were allowed to kind of be more mysterious in the first movie. And I think whether or not Deckard is a replicant, it kept people talking about the movie for years. Like, people were analyzing his dreams and analyzing the lines of dialogue, and they were just obsessed. And I feel like this movie wouldn't have hurt to have a little bit more mystery, but also what it's missing is just a really dynamic villain, the way Rutger Hauer was in that first movie. Rutger Hauer gave us one of the most poetic and one of the most sublime performances by an actor in the history of the science fiction genre, which is a very tough act to follow. I mean, Sylvia Hex, she was awesome, and she was scary, and she was dangerous. But that fight with the car and the ocean at the end, it basically what it boils down to is just a fight scene. But you don't have a situation where Rutger Hauer is basically, in the most poetic way possible, describing all these experiences he's had and how all these moments are going to be lost. And then when you see his eyes closed and that bird flying, I mean, it's one of the most transcendent moments in the history of the science fiction genre. I'm getting goosebumps up and down my back and neck, even remembering it. And that is hard to replicate. That is hard to do. And this movie, frankly, just doesn't have scenes that are on that level.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
On the other hand, name me another director who can do a 3-hour R-rated sci-fi extravaganza like this, which has abundant nudity and all kinds of crazy shit going on. So I think it's one of those movies that I'll continue to wrestle with. I just don't think it's as fun to watch as Dune Part 1, and I don't think it's as fun to watch as Sicario, and it's definitely not as powerful as Prisoners. I'm just going to keep coming back to Prisoners. I think that's really Denis Villeneuve doing his best work of his career. But who knows, maybe Dune Part 2, maybe I'll feel that way in a few weeks' time when I finally see it. But let's move on to Dune Part 1.
Remove your hand from the box, and you die.
I've made so many videos about Dune over the last couple of years due to the trailers and the movies and like my live streams of Bill Scurry. Like, I don't want to just regurgitate everything that I've said about Dune Part 1 in those other videos. But the reality is, he's kind of nailing it. I mean, the reality is I'm always going to have my nitpicky grievances because I love the book. I've read the book several times. In my mind, I've got like an idea of what the perfect Dune is. But the reality is, I don't have to worry about a filmmaker ever making the perfect version of Dune because the perfect version of Dune already exists. It's called Dune by Frank Herbert. It will remain available and in circulation until the end of time. So anytime somebody wants to have the full, undiluted, perfect Dune experience, the book is there. Pick it up, read it, fall into it. It's unlike anything else. My one main knock against his adaptation of the material is how he just ran out of time or just wasn't as interested in exploring the mentats. And if you really want to understand the metamorphosis that Paul Atreides is going through as he becomes the Kwisatz Haderach, you need to understand all the various disciplines that he's been studying, which allow him to become the person he's becoming once he gets exposed to the spice melange, as well as all the other experiences in the book. And obviously, you need his Bene Gesserit training through his mother. You need all the science that he's learned through Dr. Yui. You need the warrior skills that he's accumulated through Gurney Halleck and Duncan Idaho. And you need the mentat training that he's been accumulating through Thufir Hawat. And one of the coolest parts of the book is when he realizes that he's been groomed and trained to become a mentat all along, but a mentat, they can't know that they're going through that grooming or that training until there comes a time where they have to decide to either commit to that course of action or abandon it. And he decides to commit to that, and that's when they realize he will eventually become a very formidable Duke. But as far as the things that the movie got right, I mean, just the overall look, it's definitely one of the best looking and one of the most otherworldly, transportive science fiction experiences that I've ever seen. When I'm watching it, I'm not thinking, oh, they shot this here or they shot that there. I'm thinking, oh, they're on fucking Arrakis or they're on Gidi Prime or they are on Caladan. Like, I completely bought into the verisimilitude of that world. But I think Rebecca Ferguson is absolutely astonishing as Lady Jessica. As far as Gurney Halleck goes, I probably prefer Patrick Stewart from David Lynch's original, but Josh Brolin's doing fine. Stellan Skarsgård as the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Holy shit, yeah. I mean, he just looks grotesque, and he's just leaning into what is probably my favorite villain in the history of literature in any genre. And with this next bit of praise, I don't want to sound too grandiose, but I feel like Dune's one of the only examples in recent years, alongside movies like Oppenheimer, that are a reminder that movies can be a hit and prestigious all at once. It's not an either or kind of binary situation like, oh, we're going to go for awards with a movie that only costs a couple million, or we're going to go for the big bucks and make a movie for a couple $100 million and just dumb it down and just make it a movie for morons, hoping that we'll make $1 billion. I completely reject the idea that in order for a movie to be successful, you have to make it idiotic, because history is filled with so many examples that prove that audiences are ready for prestigious films that are also blockbusters. The Godfather by Francis Ford Coppola is proof that audiences want those experiences. The Deer Hunter by Michael Cimino is proof that audiences want those experiences. Lawrence of Arabia by David Lean is proof that audiences want those experiences, that it is possible to generate awards, box office, and a movie that people will watch for decades, but you have to want it. You have to have a filmmaker with the talent that can deliver that kind of story, but also a filmmaker who's crafty enough and enough of an industry pro or an industry veteran to understand how to get all the forces within the industry aligned to make that possible. And for anybody who wants to see what's involved with that kind of filmmaking, I strongly recommend the book, The Path to Paradise by Sam Wasson, which details Francis Ford Coppola's career from the late 60s to the early 80s, where movies like The Godfather Part 1 and 2 and Apocalypse Now didn't come out of nowhere. Like, he had to fight like hell to make those. And there were a lot of failures along the way before he had the experience and the opportunities to make those movies. And just seeing how like George Lucas went from a flop like THX 1138 to making a runaway success like American Graffiti. And I feel like it's just a brilliant book about the tension between artistic integrity and commercial viability. But getting back to Villeneuve and franchise filmmaking, I just feel like there's so many people right now, both who work in the giant studios, who are, the execs in the suits, as well as some filmmakers who not only don't seem to understand the material that they're adapting, whether that's a comic or a book or a remake or whatever, but seem to have active contempt for the original source material, as well as those people who like it. It's like, oh, like you're all just a bunch of film bros, blah, blah, blah. Like no one cares what you think. Like your passion and your expertise and your decades of fandom mean nothing, because what we're adapting, what we want is the visibility of something that has a name or an established reputation, but we're going to throw out all the details to make it special and unique. And we're going to hire filmmakers who don't understand it at all. And we're just going to roll the dice and hope for the best. Like, well, maybe instead of rejecting the people who like this stuff, embrace the people who like this stuff, whether that's the filmmaker or the fans or whatever. Like, I just never understand this idea of throwing away an existing fan base in favor of one that might not exist. Like, instead, make a Dune movie or Dune franchise that appeals to people that like Dune. And that appears to be what Denis Villeneuve is doing. So Hollywood conventional wisdom. I shouldn't even call it conventional wisdom, just conventional thinking, groupthink. Because if something leads to shitty movies and movies that are failures commercially, can you really call it wisdom? So I don't want to get up on my high horse. I'm just thrilled and delighted that Denis Villeneuve is alive and well making movies. I don't know if Dune Part 2 is going to be one of those movies where when I see it, I'm like, I can't believe you made that creative decision. Now I hate you and your movie, blah, blah, blah. Like, it might lead to me having a big temper tantrum for some reason, or I might walk out of it and say, he is the greatest filmmaker alive today. I don't think he's the greatest filmmaker alive today, but I always remain open to being persuaded that he is. My favorite filmmaker alive today is Paul Verhoeven, or at least favorite filmmaker who's alive and active. Like maybe Werner Herzog. I guess he's still active as well, but not as active as he once was. But yeah, that's a hard choice. Like, who is your favorite filmmaker who's alive today, who is still actively making movies? But Denis Villeneuve, I would say when it comes to big budget movies, he's definitely one of the most talented directors alive in the world today. And the good news is he was born in 1967, so he's only, 50? He'll be 57 this year. He might direct movies for 20, 25 more years if he wishes to. Or who knows, maybe he'll take another one of those 8-year hiatuses where he just wants to kind of rethink his career. I hope he won't do that. I hope for someone who's as talented as he is, as gifted as he is, I hope he'll either be making shows or movies. But I'll be curious to see what horizons remain for him to explore. Maybe he's said all he has to say when it comes to science fiction, but no matter what he does in the future, I'll be first in line. So hope you enjoyed this little retrospective or look back at the filmography of Denis Villeneuve. And I hope I've encouraged some of you to see some of these movies that you've not seen for the first time, because I love doing these filmography videos. It's almost like being like a comic book collector, and like I really want to have like the first 100 issues of Fantastic Four to get the entire Stan Lee, Jack Kirby run. And I feel in a lot of ways the same way about directors' careers. When I like a director, I want to see their entire career, the peaks, the valleys, the masterpieces as well as the flops. And if you like this video, the good news is there are still many, many, many directors that I would like to give this treatment to. And it's hard to get motivated sometimes to tackle a director where their career is finished. Like they died decades ago, but there are dozens of directors, who knows, maybe even hundreds of directors that I feel like deserve to have filmography videos made about them. But it's hard to sometimes give myself like the kick in the butt that I need to make it, unless there's a release right around the corner or something to get excited about. Like with Coppola, his final movie is coming out in a couple months at Cannes, Megalopolis. He's been wanting to make it for decades. It'll be the perfect excuse to make a bunch of videos about his entire career and his best movies and his worst movies, etc. But you let me know down in the comments below if there are any other directors alive today where you would like to see me do a similar video about their entire career to date. But I think I'm officially starting to ramble. It's time to wrap this sucker up. Hope you enjoyed the video. If so, like the video, subscribe, hit that notification bell. You know the drill, and hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrax. But thank you so much for watching. I greatly appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.